Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aaron Etra. I'm chair of the Executive Committee of the Council of Organizations. I know most of you, but I want to wish all of you welcome on behalf of the Council of Organizations of the United Nations Association of the USA, which I'm privileged to chair the Executive Committee. And the COO is a confederation of NGOs with the wish to be able to offer to our members the opportunity to participate in programs like this and other activities during the year. So I'd like to encourage all of you who are members of organizations that are not part of the council as yet to please sign up, and there's a sign-up sheet in the rear at the table that you registered when you came in. So please do that. And this is an example of activities that the COO does in collaboration with, as I say, wonderful NGOs and organizations. A lot of that will be explained by our moderator, who represents one of those organizations and is also our vice chair. It's also our privilege today, in addition to celebrating the launch of the paper, to bring to your attention the opportunity to purchase a book about the United Nations Association of the USA, a wonderful history, little known history of advocacy and action. I mean, the things that we're all involved in. Everybody in this room is an advocate and an action person, I know, both personally and just looking around the room. So I think you'd be very interested in this book. You can subscribe for it online, or you can, at the table in the entrance, also sign up to receive a copy of it. So I encourage you to do that. There are other opportunities for you during the year under the council auspices to have programs of your choice. So we encourage you, please let me know if there's some activity that you'd like to enlist our cooperation and sponsorship of. You will see the group that sponsored this program and other programs, but we're here for you, we're of you, we are NGOs ourselves, each one of us represents an organization in addition to our role in the council. So please let me know if there's something that you'd like to do under our auspices. And now, you didn't come to hear me, so let me turn the program over to our vice chair and moderator for the day, Mark Jordan.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Aaron. My name is Mark Jordan. I'm the UN Programs and Outreach Manager for the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. I'm also the Vice Chair of the UNA USA Council of Organizations. So thank you all for being here today. I'll be moderating the event, which is organized by UNA USA, COO, and it's focused around the topic, the role of civil society in supporting international development and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the event will be divided into two parts. It will be a launch of a study by the PTF, the Partnership for Transparency Fund. The topic of this study is civil society and development. And then we'll have a second part, which will be a more of an interactive, first of a panel discussion with our speakers, and then an opportunity for a Q&A and a discussion about this topic, which I know you're all very keen to get engaged on. So the event itself, first of all, was organized with the support of some key organizations, which I'd like to list. So we have the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development, Partnership for Transparency Fund, who are the authors of this study today, the League of Women Voters, UNA USA Southern New York State Division, the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development, the DPI NGO Executive Committee, the World Council of Peoples for the United Nations, and Virginia Gildersleeve International Fund. So I'd like to thank all of those organizations. To begin with, before we start our discussion, I'd like to situate the event in the UN calendar. This debate is taking place shortly after July's high-level political forum on sustainable development. This was the first meeting at the UN as the central platform of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in September of last year. It is also running in parallel with the General Assembly, its 71st session, and the ongoing meetings of its second committee, which run until the 23rd of November and will cover matters related to economic growth and development, including sustainable development. Furthermore, Habitat 3 conference will be taking place in Quito, Ecuador on the 17th of October. This is a landmark conference which takes place every 20 years within the UN system, and it is an opportunity for multi-stakeholders from around the world to discuss the challenge of how cities and towns can become better planned and managed and fulfill their role as drivers of sustainable development. Finally, on November 7th, the international community will reconvene in Marrakesh to discuss how it will implement the commitments made by 195 UN member states when they adopted the first ever universal and legally binding global climate deal. So noting the considerable focus of the UN agenda on matters related to sustainable development and the overlap of this issue between the different meetings, this is therefore an important time for us to revisit the role that civil society plays in international development, and in particular sustainable development, given the agenda for the next 15 years. We'll be looking at the impact it has and what it can have on the implementation of this agenda. So to help us debate this issue today, we have some very notable speakers with us. We have Sarah Little, who's the Program and Communications Manager for Partnership for Transparency Fund. Sarah joined the fund in 2013 to lead the organization's communications and programs. Partnership for Transparency Fund is a civil society organization that advances innovative citizen-led action to improve governance, promote transparency, and reduce corruption in developing countries. We also have with us Ed Elmendorf, who's the former president and chief executive of the United Nations Association of the USA. Ed has been actively involved in international organizations for 50 years. He joined the Foreign Service early on in his career in the 60s. He then began a 30-year career with the World Bank. He's volunteered as president of UNA USA in the National Capital Area, and he then joined the board of UNA USA in 2009. Ed has been particularly active within this field, within the UNA USA field. He's recently written a publication which Aaron mentioned to you, and I think he'll be a great contributor to this discussion too. Our third speaker is Jeffery Huffines, is CIVICUS UN representative to New York. Jeff joined CIVICUS in April 2009 as the main representative at the UN in New York. CIVICUS is an organization based in South Africa. It's the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. It's an international alliance working with organizations and individuals in more than 160 countries to strengthen citizen action and civil society throughout the world. So, altogether, we have quite an exciting program for you and some interesting speakers who are going to present, first of all, the study. This will be Sarah and Ed, who are both going to be co-presenting the study that you have for you today on civil society and development. They'll be focusing in particular on recommendations and practice to enhance the role of civil society in international development, and in particular with regards to implementation of the SDGs. To comment on and respond on their presentation, Jeff will present findings by his own organizations, by CIVICUS, on particularly the topic of civil society and exclusion, and on the resourcing of civil society. We'll also have an additional presentation from Sarah Dayringer, who's a program officer with Global Policy Watch, and she'll bring to light her organization's research on the role of private funding and corporate influence on the UN. So quite an extensive but wonderful program. Now, as I said, we'll have an opportunity to interact with the speakers afterwards, after their presentations. We've allotted about 30 minutes of time for you guys to really quiz them on what they've told you. So hopefully we can make this as interactive as possible. And then we have some refreshments as well. It's just available for you now if you wanted to take them, but we can also have them after the event. So I think we'll start with our first two speakers, so Ed and Sarah, if you wanted to come up.
Today is a public launch of this study by PTF on civil society and development. The lead author, Vinay Bhargava, is the chief technical advisor of the partnership. Unfortunately, due to an illness, he was not able to join us today. Sarah and I are both co-authors, and Sarah has extensive PTF experience. This is us with the COO and the partnership, and give you a sense of the roadmap, what we're going to do. A little bit at the beginning to put it all in context. And then Sarah will present the 6 global trends that are highlighted in the PTF study. I'll go on with implications and recommendations in relation to work of NGOs on the Sustainable Development Goals, and Sarah will illustrate this in practice with some of the things that PTF have done. The context, broadly speaking, what you see here, and I think people like Jeff and others in this room probably have experienced this themselves, know it in many ways better than any. In the early years of development, international development was largely seen as a state responsibility. With the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals at the turn of the millennium, NGOs began to get more increasingly involved, but the MDGs were nonetheless a backroom deal fundamentally, even though they had their origins in the large UN conferences of the 90s. As the MDGs moved towards expiration in 2015, we had a completely different kind of movement that involved, with discussions organized by the UN, by NGOs around the world on what was to succeed the MDGs. And many NGOs and UNDP and so forth had discussions around the world. This in turn led into the Open Working Group, which many of you probably know. Again, just the title gives a sense of the difference in the process, much more open. And then with the adoptions of the SDGs, we moved this year with the high-level political forum into issues of implementation, and this is where it becomes even more serious. Sarah will now take over on the 6 trends that we see.
First, why the 6 trends, why write this report now? And as Ed demonstrated, there's a clear commitment to engage with civil society, especially for the SDGs, but there's a lot of ambiguity still around how exactly that works, how do we finance it, who takes what responsibilities. And this really isn't a surprise. We see this often, that there's a commitment, there's that proclamation that we'll work with citizens, we'll work with civil society, but then in practice it's really more difficult. So these trends are meant to help stakeholders better understand civil society and how to work with them, and thus formulate better engagement strategies. So without further ado, trend number 1, growing number and influence of CSOs. So there's been a tremendous change in the landscape over the last 15 years. In 1990, before 15 years, 25 years, in 1990 there were 6,000 international nonprofits, INGOs, and by 2013 they totaled over 40,000, and that's expected to grow by another 1,200 every year. And of course there's money that comes along with these activities, and it's estimated that INGOs channel about $70 billion to developing countries every year, so that's quite significant. And the same is true at the country level. There's a proliferation of CSOs. In India, there's 2 million, US, 1.5 million, and in China, 460,000. And the influence of this large number of CSOs, generally in development, we can say they're raising a lot of funds. Obviously, you have that $70 billion. They're developing a lot of innovations. I like to think that's because they're kind of unhinged from bureaucracy, so they're able to be more flexible. They're encouraging transparency and accountability. Of course, CSOs work for the interests of citizens, not for private companies or for governments, so they're able to hold the private sector and the public sector accountable. And then mobilizing beneficiaries. So in development programs, CSOs are really good at getting the people who we're trying to reach involved. Trend number 2, more collaborative frameworks. So there were two, let me see, lost my notes. So there were two high-level forums, the OECD World Bank forums on aid effectiveness in 2008 and 2011 that, again, made this commitment to engaging civil society and having partnerships. And that gained a little steam with the Open Government Partnership, which is meant to help broker greater commitments for citizen engagement. And their structure is to have, their managing structure is to have equal numbers of CSOs and governments, as well as for multilateral development banks. But everybody's on the same level, they're on the same footing. And then as this trend's gained steam, there's a lot of examples of global partnerships and global funds that include CSOs as equal partners as governments and other large international organizations. And again, the driving force behind this is the recognition that civil society is an essential partner. We can't do it without them. So trend number 3 is a growing source of development finance. We sort of touched on that already. But it's worth noting again that it's a huge force. We have an estimated $50 billion a year that INGOs send to developing countries, and that's raised entirely from private sources, so foundations and individuals. It's not coming from governments or from the big banks. And that's another $19 billion is channeled through the INGOs from governments or the banks, but that about 70% is privately raised, and they're using this funding to do their own independent projects, sometimes almost completely independent of governments. And again, this is just a clear, the SDG philanthropy platform, they're recognizing that there has to be a partnership between all of these players, and that's just a recognition of how much civil society is bringing to the table these days. Okay. So, trend number 4. Civil society is taking initiatives to enhance its own governance and accountability. That generally takes the form of membership and certification schemes where you have codes of conduct and then you report on your conduct. A good example of this is the Better Business Bureau. It's voluntary. You don't have to report on all their criteria by law, but of course it gives you a boost and makes you look a little more legitimate if you do. And there's a big framework, the International NGO Accountability Charter, and you can see the 10 different criteria there, and they're working to develop kind of a global standard for both NGOs and national codes. And again, just a growing example of how CSOs are increasing their legitimacy globally. Trend number 5. I think this is the most interesting, but then again, I wrote this section of the paper, so I would. There's a varied space for CSO engagement. So at the international level, there's a really clear commitment to involving CSOs, but at the national level, of course, this is quite varied. And we see two contradictory trends. On the one hand, there's a huge commitment, again, even by governments, at the SDGs, the OGP, the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, which tries to encourage more engagement. And that can be illustrated by this map here. About half the countries here are eligible to participate in the Open Government Partnership, which means they have basic criteria, laws around citizen participation and openness. Then you have another 16 that are working on it through the GPSA. And so together, it's a pretty good proportion of the world that's quite open to citizen engagement. But then, of course, on the other hand, we see a lot of constraints. These generally take the form of access to funding. So we've seen a lot of governments that refuse foreign funding of domestic CSOs. There can be really onerous registration requirements that are almost impossible to fulfill unless you know someone who can help push the application through, of course. And then there are restrictions on freedom of assembly and association. The International Center for Nonprofit Law estimates, I think, 120 different laws that have been proposed in 60 countries that restrict people's right to freedom of assembly and association. So that's quite concerning. But even in the most repressive regimes, there are actions that citizens can take to engage. This is the OGP spectrum of participation. So at the top, it's the most basic form of citizen engagement, just to inform citizens what you're doing, and then the more the most intense is at the bottom, to empower citizens to really be participating in the planning, implementation, and monitoring of development programs. So for information, to inform, a good example would be if this is restricted in a country, you would have CSOs lobbying for right to information sort of legislation. If it is enabled, then of course you have CSOs that are monitoring what the government's putting out and just analyzing it and processing it for citizens to absorb. And then we'll just skip down for time's sake to the empowerment level, and there are examples in the report of what citizens or what CSOs can do in each situation. But if we just skip ahead to empowerment, an example would be if that's not enabled, then you would build the capacity of the government, of civil society to work together. And if it is enabled, you're kind of at the gold standard. The CSOs are participating in everything, in every element of development. And then lastly, trend number 6. This won't surprise anybody who's in this space, but there's growing, especially funding concerns around sustainability. CSOs tend to get funding for specific projects, but as far as their kind of general operating support, sometimes that falls flat. This was the focus of 2 big reports, the 2015 World Economic Forum and the CIVICUS' report, State of Civil Society. But there are, and as we've discussed, there's a lot of funding that goes to civil society, so you can't say that that's not the case, but there are major gaps, particularly in countries with restrictions on foreign funding. We talked about that. We've recently had trouble establishing an office in India. We have affiliates around the world, one in India, and they are not allowed to operate with foreign funding for the first 2 years, so we're not allowed to support them. They have to raise that in country. Also, middle-income countries sometimes get left out of the mix. They drop off donor priority lists, but they haven't yet really developed the domestic systems to fund the civil groups. And then, of course, for governance and transparency initiatives, and this is especially in countries either where that's restricted or where the fundraising is, or the funding for development is more around traditional things like, food aid or housing. But of course, governance and transparency touches on all of those things. If you don't have a well-functioning government, if they're corrupt and stealing all the money, well then whatever was sent for water programs or for food programs isn't getting there. So this is important in all environments. And now I'll turn it back to Ed for the implications, which are, I think, much more interesting.
Let me just run through here. We have recommendations for a series of different parties, starting here with governments, but we will move on then to donors and private sources and so forth. A few words of context, just to underscore SDG 17 and the significance of partnerships between governments, private sector, and civil society for the implementation of the SDGs. And clearly, the SDG agenda as a whole is about this, incredibly important. So the first recommendation is to facilitate and ensure CSO contributions to SDG strategy and policy. There is nothing that is automatic about this happening. The CSO community has to be active and push governments so that they can contribute. But governments in turn should also welcome that engagement in strategy issues with the CSO community. And pushing down further, we would like to see governments partnering with CSOs on the design and monitoring of national action plans for the SDG agenda. That's where it will get practical, that's where it will get operational. All the nice noises can be made at the UN and in general pronouncements, but if that doesn't happen, there won't be the kind of engagement with the CSO community that we think is essential. Third, we expect governments to ensure an enabling environment for CSO activity. That's not so straightforward. There are legal and policy impediments, not only in the environments that Sarah outlined, but also elsewhere. Some of you have probably heard of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, which was established among OECD governments following the 9/11 attacks in the interest of preventing the flow of funds through NGOs for terrorist activity. The initial regulations put forward by the FATF were incredibly restrictive of NGOs, and it created a serious problem. There was blowback from that. They've been revised, but we need to make sure that governments follow through on that and that they follow revised regulations coming from the FATF. But that's not the only aspect of NGO law and regulation which is important for facilitating and encouraging CSO involvement in the SDGs. Finally, a recommendation for governments to permit, allow, encourage NGOs to engage in activities which will actually earn them revenue. Business, if you will, but it's not obviously business in the normal private sector sense. But if the CSO community are going to be successful and sustainable in the long run, they have to have new and different ways of raising money, and one of those is revenue earning activities. Governments may, however, restrict that. They may say that's not your role. What we're saying is we think that should be part of it. Then our recommendations for donor institutions, bilateral and multilateral, but more specifically the aid agencies as opposed to governments more generally. Much of this, what we have here, is addressed particularly to the multilateral development banks, but not only. It certainly should apply to UN agencies and including UNDP. First is to make sure that CSO contributions to their own activity affecting the SDGs are brought in. What is, say, the Asian Development Bank going to do about the SDGs? What we're saying here is that it's important the Asian Development Bank and its peer organizations engage with the CSO community on their strategies for the SDGs. Secondly, as aid agencies, bilateral, multilateral, whatever, collaborate with recipient governments, they should be encouraging those governments to engage with the CSO community. For most of these agencies, development has been a state activity. They haven't looked beyond the government, but we're arguing here that they should be encouraging their government partners to engage with the CSOs. Thirdly, we're encouraging donor agencies to disclose their program information in ways that will be helpful to the CSO community. Very often it's quite opaque, or there's just reams and reams of information that is put out that is quite inaccessible and incomprehensible. Make it available, make it usable. Fourth, look at the elements in their programs in specific countries that can be implemented or better implemented with a partnership with CSOs. That's a question of going through their own strategies in a very concrete and practical way and look, what can we do here? How will what we're trying to do here, particularly in regard to the SDGs, can CSOs engage more effectively. And finally, this is a very tough one. Seek independent CSO monitoring of programs. What this says in practice is that institutions like the World Bank should be inviting the CSO community to monitor what the World Bank is doing in the Philippines or Nepal, Bangladesh, and to do this independently with independent funds. That's been an enormous challenge, but I think that will increase the reality on the ground of SDG implementation. We're strongly encouraging that. Recommendations for philanthropists and other private aid donors. Fund programs involving partnerships with CSOs and governments. Get into a trilateral arrangement of some kind to bring CSOs, governments together and to support them financially. Support programs in countries where governments are soliciting philanthropy. Sometimes the governments don't know quite how to go about this. And so we address the philanthropic community and say, work with them on that. Help them to make that happen. And finally, channel funds through multilateral agencies. This is important because many philanthropic organizations don't have the capacity to reach large numbers of countries. Multilateral organizations can do a lot with that. And finally, recommendations for CSOs themselves. Get into a proactive stance with government and the private sector. Look for new and different kinds of partnerships. Don't stand back. There's often a tendency for many of us to remain in our own silo. This is talking about outreach here in new and different ways. That means also developing the confidence to be able to do that. Engage in responsible policy advocacy. Policy advocacy by all means, yes, but do it responsibly. You've got to be a responsible partner if you're going to be able to engage carefully and well. It's not just rhetoric and attacks. It has to be constructive engagement between the CSO community and the public authorities. Build your own advocacy capacity. Advocacy requires careful staff work. Know your audience. Know the people you're trying to work with. It doesn't help just to make some general pronouncement out there and to say, okay, we're engaged in advocacy. That's not the way you're going to make it happen. Thirdly, listen, listen, listen. This is where the CSO community has a comparative advantage. You can be on the ground, actually knowing what's going on in ways that public authorities may not. Amplify the voices of citizens. Amplify the voices of those who frequently tend to be excluded from publicly sponsored programs. But also respond to needs. It isn't only just a question of having a supply of a certain kind of thing. You've got to know really what's going on the ground and respond to the needs of the people. Monitor government and donor programs. This is the counterpart of what I was talking about before. Having the CSO community really look over the shoulders of government. Look over the shoulders of the donor. Try to get into a collaborative relationship for that, by all means. It's not just free criticism. It has to be collaborative. Convince the others, convince the donors that you and the CSO community have got new ideas, new information, new access to bring to the table. And finally, network with other CSOs engaged in the SDGs. This will strengthen the voice of the NGO community immeasurably in the work on the SDGs. Now I'd like to give the mic back to Sarah. We'll talk a little bit about how some of this plays itself out in PTF.
SDGs and the PTF experience. We've talked a lot about what we should do, but I think I started by saying in practice it's a lot more difficult. So let me talk a little bit about what we've done in practice. So first of all, our mission, the Partnership for Transparency Fund, and we're working to advance citizen-led approaches to improve governance and reduce corruption in developing countries. And the really unique thing about PTF is that we're managed, and most of the legwork is done by about 100 volunteer advisors. And most, like Ed, we're so lucky to have Ed, and most of them are just like Ed. They're ex-officials of the World Bank who have a lot of knowledge to give, and they give it to us pro bono. Also good to note that they fund all of our general operating expenses, so they're really, really generous people, including my salary, of course. So, we have a global network of affiliates. We have our headquarters in DC. We also have an office in Munich, just established an office in Delhi, and we've had one, a very active office in Manila. And very soon we'll have an office in South Africa as well, so we can be neighbors with CIVICUS. We've completed more than 250 projects now in 53 countries. And these are all with local civil society groups. They've done really amazing, incredible work to curb corruption in all kinds of sectors. So it can be done wherever extortion is common. And our theory of change, and this is particularly applicable to SDG 16 on governance, we've found that it's been very effective, and I imagine it will continue to be. And this is what's the theory that's underlying all of the projects we support. And this is kind of small, but we start by raising community awareness of rights and benefits. Of course, if the community doesn't know what benefits they should be receiving, then it's hard for them to hold the government accountable for actually providing them. And that generally takes care of a lot of issues. If citizens know that I'm supposed to get, food aid on Monday, and the food aid doesn't come, then they're pretty vocal about it. Second, we form and empower citizen groups for collective action. Often those groups already exist, but we do kind of volunteer development and things like that to get more people involved. Next, as Ed talks about, we monitor performance and create pressure for better results, and this can take a lot of different forms. We'll talk about some specifics next. And then constructively engage with authorities to demand responsiveness. And this is a unique and important aspect of all of our programs, that we require government support before we engage. This is basically because we feel like you need some level of engagement from the government as well to really make progress. And then finally, monitor changes and close the feedback loop. So let citizens know after they've participated what exactly the result was of all that time and effort. So some successful PTF civil society initiatives and partnerships. In Nepal and Bangladesh, we just finished a project, really interesting, monitoring World Bank projects. And usually how this is done is, if there is a citizen engagement component on the project for evaluation, it's written in under the World Bank project, it's funded by the loan or the grant, and it's actually part of the project. So what we tried to do here was we got independent funding and independent CSOs to take the temperature on the ground and let the bank and the beneficiaries know how well the program was going. So we had some really, really interesting results. Obviously, this was the first time it was done, and the bank's taking a bit of a risk by not controlling all the feedback that comes back, but it had really positive impacts. So we hope it gains steam. The CSOs helped, of course, back to the theory of change, they helped raise awareness on program and benefits, they helped citizens participate in the programs, and they created structures for citizens to give meaningful feedback. And this was in 11 projects spanning from education, clean water, renewable energy, road construction, jobs training. And the results in general, in very broad terms, were that the community awareness of the programs and benefits increased. beneficiaries were motivated to demand better resource use or transparent resource use. Beneficiaries became more articulate in providing feedback, so not, I don't like this program, but exactly why, and with empirical data. And then service providers became more responsible to citizen requests. So they felt that pressure, and if something wasn't working, they felt like they had to do something about it. And this example touches on virtually any SDG with just the basic idea that better governance leads to better services. And more inclusive services. So when it's being implemented efficiently and transparently, generally we get better results. So our second example is in the Balkans. We have a program called the Metzger Rule of Law Initiative, and it tries to get citizens involved with rule of law, which maybe seems a little abstract for normal citizens to be involved in this technical area. But again, we made some good progress. Specifically, the first project we had was monitoring corruption trial proceedings. They had some particular trouble in the Balkans where people would be convicted of corruption, and then as the trial went on, it just kind of got swept under the rug. So they trained about, this is a local group, trained about 80 monitors, including human rights advocates, journalists, and citizens on just procedures in the court and what should be taking place. They observed the court cases, produced reports, and put them on a public website that gets about 3,000 hits a month. They also have schedules of court proceedings so that citizens can go and see it for themselves if they like. And it's just been a really good way to demonstrate accountability. And then lastly, my favorite, our project in Uganda, which is working to improve public services with technology. And this is, I think this illustrates the SDG 17, the partnerships. How does it work? So the core concept of this program is that we have these really large organizations that have really complicated data gathering or kind of community feedback mechanisms, but the local CSOs on the ground just don't have the resources to build these kinds of systems. They can't build an SMS system and maintain it. That's just not sustainable if they were able to do it in the first place. So our idea was to connect these larger projects, technology projects, to local CSO organizations. And how this works in practice, in this case, we work with UNICEF's U-Report program. And that's a huge program in many countries. In Uganda, they have about 300,000 subscribers on their mobile phone. And UNICEF will send out periodic public opinion polls or alerts. And they had been using this information to just inform the NPs. So I like to use the example, they may send out a message for all of you in school, how many of your teachers showed up today? And 50% may say, my teacher didn't show up. So that's something they can take to the national government and say, hey, look, you have a problem here, teachers aren't showing up. But then, as you can imagine, someone might, the next week, when their teacher doesn't show up, send a message to the same service saying, hey, she didn't show up again, or he didn't show up again. And in that case, there wasn't much UNICEF could do in response. They're way too big, and they're at the national level, so if a teacher doesn't show up to a classroom, what can you do? So we thought, well, we can link them with local groups. Obviously, they have the technology prowess to be able to use this, so why aren't they? I could get into that. I could go into a whole side of why this wasn't being done before. So what did the CSO do? U-Report gets these complaints, they're unsolicited, and then sends them to the local CSO for verification. Let me move on here. So here's the first step. And in this case, again, this is specific to Uganda, but it could take lots of different forms in different countries, in different contexts. So the first step is, so a citizen sends in a complaint or a grievance. U-Report was getting these unsolicited, which is how we got the idea to do this, but of course we've added other elements for people who aren't technology literate, who don't like to SMS. So they can call Transparency International's anti-corruption hotline, or come up to one of our volunteers or the local CSOs we're working with to submit a complaint. Once they're received by the CSO, then we move into kind of the advocacy phase. We engage, inform, and advocate. So this, again, can take a lot of different forms, and it should be very locally specific. So the pilot project that we just finished a pilot of this, and so it was in one district, it's a fairly small population, so we had these standard ways of engaging and informing, but this would change in every region, not even throughout every country. So we did a lot of radio programs and radio jingles. We had a lot of one-on-one consultations, so if we have a problem with a particular service provider, sometimes it just takes a conversation. Hey, what's going on? Is there a way we can help you do this better? We have community meetings, which are really effective in Uganda. People get really upset, and they will let you know what's going on in their community, and then the service providers have to answer right there and then. We've had some really interesting community meetings where people have been arrested on the spot. And then the national level working group, that's really interesting. There's a national level CSO that can take the local complaints back up to the national level. So we had a case where someone was stealing government drugs and selling them in the market, and the CSO told the police about it, and the police said, well, that's interesting, but since we don't have proof that they stole it, there's really not much we can do. And they said, well, the tablets have government of Uganda written right on it. Clearly they got this from a government source, there's no question, but they wouldn't do anything about it. So the CSO took it to the national level and talked to some agencies who then applied the pressure back down, and they said, no, you need to investigate this, and lo and behold, the next day someone was arrested. And then lastly, resolve and report. So once there are resolutions to some of these problems, then we send that information back to the subscribers and let them know, the fruits of their labor. So the results of this program, we've had some really great results. It's, as I said, this has just been one pilot project in one small district. But we estimate about an extra $100,000 was spent in the district on healthcare because of these interventions, because people were paying attention and asking for what they deserve. In general, public awareness increased, there was improved citizen government relations, better communication between the local and national government, like the example I just gave, and better informed and vigilant authorities. During the pilot, like I said, in the small district, there were some concrete results, like they dug new pit latrines and new placenta pits and trash pits. They started burning the trash. They repaired some equipment and got new equipment. In particular, they got a new ambulance. The district had been completely without an ambulance for 2 years, so now they have a new one. They have gotten a new x-ray machine, a new ultrasound machine. This picture on the left is the general hospital in the district. The maternity center and child health center is being completely renovated. And then that picture up there is from the drug raid I talked about, just stolen drugs being recovered. Really interesting results. I wish I had all day to talk about what we've achieved there, but I don't. So just to wrap it up, key lessons from our experience for the SDGs. Obviously, CSOs increase transparency and accountability in public institutions. And this is because they're paying attention, they're challenging them, they're demanding to know more about the programs that are going on. CSOs improve the integrity of public procurement. This is a little specific, but we've seen a lot of really important gains in terms of public procurement. That's a huge opportunity for corruption to take a lot of money. So again, if somebody's just paying attention where the money goes and tracking that, it can be really impactful. CSOs reduce corruption in public services. Again, the beneficiaries generally want the services that are afforded to them, so if we can support them in giving good feedback, that's very helpful. And then CSOs encourage greater government responsiveness. So same idea, they're engaging, they're paying attention, and they're telling the government what they need. So in general, we get more responsive governments. And so concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was very informative. I think at this stage we'll go on to Jeff's presentation just to keep it flowing, and then we'll revisit the contents afterwards, if that's okay. So Jeff, please.
Great. Well, I want to thank UNA USA Council of Organizations very much for inviting me to be a part of the proceedings here. Do you mind if I just shut this, or? Yeah, that's fine. Great. And I've been asked to be a respondent. So what I want to do as a respondent is speak more informally about what we have just heard, with the idea of inspiring conversation and posing some questions for all of us to consider with regard to this presentation. First, I want to congratulate the Partnership for Transparency Fund for excellent work, both with regard to the report and to your own global programs. I see tremendous synergies between your work and ours as CIVICUS, but also more broadly in terms of helping civil society to become a more effective partner in the implementation phase, in particular, of the 2030 Agenda. In fact, I think, I mean, what's very clear with the adoption of the 2030 Agenda is that we're moving from a traditional understanding of development to a transformational understanding of sustainable development. That indeed this is a universal agenda that will have profound implications in terms of how each of the partners that have been discussed this afternoon will operate now into the future. I mean, Mark, in your introduction, there you are, you know, you mentioned the different intergovernmental processes at play that we are all engaging, the different constituencies involved. We have had the HLPF, the High Level Political Forum, which is still very much in its infancy. So on the one hand, we need to be patient, and yet on the other hand, we need to address this agenda on an urgent basis at every level, at national, regional, and international levels, if the high-level political forum is to live up to its potential. Moreover, what's important is that we look at the context of the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals during these next 15 years in the broader context of recognizing that the climate agreement in Paris, that the agreement to be adopted in Habitat 3 in Quito, that all of these agreements are not just, they are overlapping indeed, but that is indicative of the integration of a universal international sustainable development agenda. And the question is really, how do we effectively integrate this agenda into our own programming? And I think what's clear in this conversation is that governments, aid agencies, philanthropists, as well as civil society itself, each of us have our own unique niche, each of us have our own contributions and characteristics, and indeed each of us have our own political dynamics to deal with. As we are very well aware, those of us who have the privilege of working here in New York with member states and with UN agencies across the street. I've mentioned the implications of the Universal Agenda, and Ed, you indeed have illustrated this in the historic context where we had the MDGs, which was really kind of focused on a more traditional paradigm where the goals were really focused on required achievements for developing countries, for the global south, shall we say. And yet, you know, a year ago at this time, member states adopted the Sustainable Development Goals that applies equally, not only to the global south, but to the developed countries, to the industrialized countries as well. And I think we're just beginning to grapple with what does that really mean. I mean, what that means on one level is that we're not just talking about aid and, you know, becoming more effective in the transmission of aid. We're really talking about a transformation of the global economy. We're talking about when we talk about goals and targets of the SDGs and the subsequent adoption of global indicators and as well as at the national level, you know, the most I would say profound set of global indicators that have a daily impact on our lives are the stock markets in Wall Street. Those are indicators that make a difference. So, you know, I would say our ultimate goal in terms of transformation is developing indicators that will move markets in the same way that Wall Street does today in that sense. So we're at a transitional moment in terms of the 2030 agenda. For the last 3 years, we've been at a time of, for NGOs and for civil society, we've been advocates, and governments have been engaged in intensive negotiations. And we've adopted the SDGs, and now we're moving into the implementation phase. And I think particularly here in New York, at the international level, there's still a question as to what implementation really means. I mean, one of the challenges that we have had in a very practical, let's say pragmatic sense here in New York is that diplomats and negotiators do what they do. They negotiate. And the personnel changes every 2 to 3 years, 4 years or so. So following the adoption of the SDGs, we had quite a turnover in staff. So I think during this past year, part of the challenge is that you had the majority of diplomats and delegates and whatnot were new to the process. They approached this agenda as if they had to continue the negotiations. So what does this really mean? What does implementation mean in a policy environment? I think that's a question that we're still grappling with, really at all levels of government and governance. So, and I would say civil society itself has that question as well. I mean, we here in New York tend to advocate. You know, we provide governments with our advocacy demands, if you will. This gets to the notion of being critics or critiques, you know, of government policy and action. Now, this is all very important. There are NGOs, as we all know, that are more into, let's say, the delivery of services, and then there are NGOs that are more into policy and advocacy change in terms of human rights in particular. Both are very important, but what does it mean in terms of this new phase of implementation? The collaborative frameworks, it's true. I mean, we've had some dramatic normative developments whereby civil society is recognized as equal partners with government, with aid agencies, with the private sector. There were agreements, as mentioned, in Accra in 2008 and Busan in 2011 regarding aid effectiveness, development effectiveness. But, you know, the question really is how can we as civil society further develop our competencies, further develop our capacity to be truly equal, in fact, and not just in policy in that sense. So I want to discuss a few findings from the perspective of CIVICUS and our work, particularly as it relates to Goal 16. I mean, we're in a bit of a paradox. I mean, on the one hand, the SDGs and Goal 16 in particular speaks to many of the recommendations that have been made. in terms of providing an enabling legal environment for the full participation of civil society, with the high-level political forum, for example, at the international level. And yet the fact is, at the national level, in many domestic contexts, there are serious threats to one or more of the civic freedoms. Now in over 100 countries. ICNL is one of our partners in a civic space initiative, and indeed it is the case that activists, particularly those who dare to challenge economic and political elites, the environment in which civil society operates is continuing to deteriorate. Now, in 2015, some activists have been actually killed and murdered in Brazil, in Colombia, in Honduras, in Peru, in the Philippines, in South Africa. They paid the ultimate price, both in terms of environmental protection, but also in terms of human rights and gender equality. So we in civil society, we need to find new ways of responding to these growing threats. Yes, we must continue to challenge legal and regulatory restrictions on our operations at the domestic level. This is very important. We must protect our funding, our voice, and our independence, but we also must continue to seek to win hearts and minds. And in this respect, your recommendations for civil society is very important, particularly those recommendations whereby civil society must also walk the talk in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, and in terms of developing capacity to be equal players in sustainable development. So, we need to be willing to critique ourselves as well. So, for example, back in 2013, CIVICUS, we looked at 100 leading NGOs around the world to see how many were women-led, just as an example. And at the time, the figure was 31. So 31 out of 100 were led by women. Congratulations. But in preparing our State of Civil Society annual report for this past year, or for this year, 2016, we looked again at these same NGOs, and the figure now stands at 38. Now, this may seem better than 31, but let's keep in mind that women make up some 2/3 of the workforce of many CSOs. So there is the possibility of a glass pyramid, shall we say, that is stifling the potential of women in civil society itself. So again, this is an example of where we as civil society need to walk the talk more effectively. Now finally, in terms of Goal 16, I want to put it into a context, and in the context of a theme. Each year, CIVICUS, we have a flagship report on the state of civil society, and we choose a theme for each year. And this year, we're looking at the themes of exclusion and inclusion. Right, okay. And so when you look at exclusion, one important dimension of exclusion and inclusion is one of identity. And so how are people excluded? Well, they're often excluded on the basis of identity, of being identified with, or as being seen as being identified with part of particular groups. Now, the fact is, identity is both dynamic as a relational category. We all identify with many different belongings and groups at the same time. And so there's the balance between the shifts in relation to who a person is interacting with, where they are, what they're doing, and what they are experiencing. And the danger in designing and implementing policies is that we see only single identities or see identity as frozen. But understanding the reality that people have multiple identities, it's possible to develop a conception of a peaceful and vibrant society as one in which people have the space, the opportunities, and confidence to celebrate and explore their multiple identities, resist stereotyping and stigma, and challenge exclusion. And Goal 16 of the SDGs commits to a vision of a peaceful and inclusive society with an assurance of justice for all, which is underpinned by effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. That's the vision. And so to realize this for CIVICUS, the three fundamental civil rights, the fundamental freedoms, the freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression are essential. And this is the essential measure by which we focus on the different elements of Goal 16. Finally, I'd like to mention, and is Sarah Dayringer here? Sarah? Oh, great. So I want to give you some time, Sarah, to take a look in particular at the findings and recommendations as it relates to finance and the role of private funding and of the corporate sector at the UN, because I think one of the findings in the research done by the Global Policy Forum, which I think is very important, particularly within the UN context, is to look at the distinction between assessed funding of the United Nations and its agencies and voluntary funding or earmarked funding. And so while I think it's appropriate and true to say that in this more dynamic context with multiple constituencies, that we as civil society also must become more creative in looking at different sources of funding. Within the context of the multilateral system, we have to ask ourselves whether these globally private financed funding mechanisms, are they at the expense of a strengthened multilateral system? I just want to mention before I give the floor to Sarah, and Sarah, if you'd like to come up, or maybe you can just come on up. That would be great. I'd like to mention the fact that I think many of you in the room know John Romano, who's the coordinator of the TAP Network, Transparency, Accountability, and Participation. Well, the TAP Network, they have a Goal 16 advocacy toolkit, and so I really encourage everyone, if you are not familiar with it already, visit their network. Visit their, of course, visit the network, but visit their website, and you can Google TAP Network, and you'll find it. This is a great practical guide on how to monitor and review the implementation of Goal 16 at both the national, regional, as well as global level. So I really recommend it. And so Sarah, thank you so much for taking a moment to share with us some of the important findings of the Global Policy Forum, and I welcome you to come on up.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad it could be.
I tried to be subtle.
So I'm working with the Global Policy Forum and Social Watch, and that's a program here based in New York that is keeping an eye on what's going on over at the UN, and trying to. I know Social Watch has watchers all over the world with different NGOs in different countries, and trying to flag anything that's happening over here that might be very, very relevant for them on the ground. And so I would dare to say the mastermind, or one of them behind Global Policy Forum, is Barbara Adams, and she couldn't be here today, but she's worked for the UN for a number of years, and blows my mind how much I'm learning just from her. But so GPF, or Global Policy Forum, has contributed a lot to the conversation around innovative financing and partnerships and UN reform. And in that conversation around financing, like Jeff mentioned, the question of private sector partnerships and the role of corporations come into play. And so I was just going to start, I guess. I just jotted some things down from some of our publications. The first one, I would say, it talks more about UN reform in the sense of how is the UN going to
tackle the 2030 agenda and really breaks down how core resources versus non-core or earmarked resources have had major implications on the progress of the UN up till 2030 agenda and throughout. So I'm going to read something from that. And it says, so fit for whose purpose? Private funding and the corporate influence in the United Nations, which is that publication, includes many examples of the consequences of this myopia across the UN system, weakening accountability and risking the reliance on and consequent capture of UN institutions by a limited number of donors, public and private. So that controversial, how much influence do earmarked resources have over the development agenda? Because if X donor country has to report that it did Y, but Z needs to be done in this country, or in this to reach this SDG, then how is the UN going to address that? Basically? So, and then also back to what Jeff was saying on implementation of the SDGs. And CSOs walking the walk. In our Spotlight report for Sustainable Development, the Social Watch partner and another one of these just amazing people, Roberto Biso, wrote one of the chapters in the Spotlight report for Sustainable Development. Plug, here's my plug. And talking about the implementation strategies not only of the SDGs, but also of the way that they're implemented. So I'm going to read another line out of this, and then I'll probably wrap it up. It's important to ensure that the monitoring and review process, like the implementation strategies themselves, not be dominated by the rich and powerful, including both countries and multinational corporations. In this regard, it is particularly worrying that in some cases, not only the implementation of certain goals and targets, but also their monitoring is being outsourced to partnerships involving funders, corporations, foundations, and civil society organizations. This self-monitoring could risk undermining independent and objective assessment. And that's in the context of UN norms and standards actually being the tool that not only voluntarily we can follow to implement the SDGs but also having those norms and standards be what guides the implementation and the assessment. And then finally, talking about private sector engagement, again, the third committee wouldn't let me put these in today, but they did a publication, GPF has done a publication, The Struggle for a UN Treaty, which is going to be, it's going to take the UN business principles to the next level and proposes a treaty that can hold corporate interest and multi-stakeholder interest in a treaty that legally assesses. So it's very interesting. So yes, the next thing I think that's really important. I guess I'll just say this, wrapping up, for civil society right now, and to kind of try to connect what's going on in New York and in a lot of these negotiations to what's happening on the ground as far as the push for and the proliferation of multi-stakeholder partnerships, is the Quadrennial Comprehensive Policy Review, which is the tool that the UN's using to guide their work for the next 4 years, in terms of how the development agenda will play out. What governments have to look at and see, do they want the UN to do these X, Y, and Z things? Are those mandates still very clear, and how will that work on the ground? And I think that will have a direct impact on what NGOs are doing and CSOs are doing on the ground, but also here in New York and what we advocate for.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I was going to say to Jeff and to all the speakers that we're going to issue a press release, and it's going to be communicated to UNA USA and on our foundation, and we'll try and include all the materials that you've listed. So I know we've spoken a lot about a lot of different content, so it'd be good to have links to all these different publications. So I'll approach you afterwards as well to try and get that material. So at this stage, I'd like to thank our speakers, first of all, for their input. I'm trying to release this microphone. But basically, we've heard from Ed and Sarah. There are two Sarahs here today. Ed and Sarah about PTF's work on the role of civil society in development, and some real practical recommendations there, particularly with regards to the future involvement with regards to the SDGs with government, but other stakeholders as well. And we had some good comments from Jeff as well on the feedback aspect, and particularly in framing that with the realities that people are facing today at the UN, facing with the turnover of staff at the member state level, but also sort of the different the funding realities that they're faced with. And I think Sarah came in at a good point there, just to talk about the private sector itself, the funding gap as well that the member states have to address with regards to accomplishing the SDGs and the 15-year framework that we have. So there's a lot of food for thought, and I think this is a good segue into our actual interaction with you guys, the actual panel discussion Q&A segment. So if the speakers would like to come up to the tables, we've got 2 handheld microphones that we're going to be able to hand out to you guys in the audience. So what I would suggest is, if you have a question, if you could put your hand up, then we'll give you the microphone. If you just say your name, the organization that you're with, and then your question. And if it's to all speakers or to one speaker in particular, that would be very helpful. We have a bit of time allotted to this, about 30 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for further networking afterwards. Okay, so if you have a question, we have people in the back of the room, just raise your hand and they'll come and give you the microphone. Thank you.
My name is Daniel Perel, and I'm a representative of the Baha'i International Community. And my question is actually with respect to trust building, as I think many of the fraying relationships that we see are based on that dissolving of trust from civil society towards the government and vice versa. And I actually have a specific question about the Uganda example. What did you see there about the nature of the relationships as civil society and government were engaged in this process? Was trust built? Did it improve those relationships? Did you see sort of an antagonistic approach? How do you think we can build on that if trust was built? So thank you.
Yeah, my name's Jesse Henshaw. I'm a consultant scientist, observant, and consulting with NGOs for the last 4 years here at the UN. And yeah, my question is a little different. I'm thrilled by what I've seen here today. There's a very comprehensive and well-organized global view of the state of the world of this explosion of healing strategies that CSOs are basically all finding different sides of to work on. But I'm struck by the synergy between the healing strategies and the forms of distress that are exploding around us at the same time, both of which are funded by the unsustainable development that we haven't learned how to measure yet, and that we have this orchestration of different parts without a real answer, because what we're still doing, we are not doing sustainable development yet. We're doing an image of sustainable development and not counting the impacts of the things that are unsustainable that we choose not to look at. And so I think this perhaps marks a wonderful moment where we're beginning to see the whole and what we need to do.
In terms of trust, yeah, it's really interesting. Again, this is one small rural district, so I don't know if it applies everywhere, but there's been a ton of trust building between the citizens and the government. At first, well, luckily we got the support of the district health official, who's the highest government representative on health, and that helped a lot. And something we've learned at PTF in general is that it's really beneficial to find a champion inside of government to help you. There's always someone who wants to do the right thing. There's always someone who got into this work because they want to help people. course there's bad seeds, and they're corrupt because they have the opportunity. But if you engage some champions and then really just monitor very closely with respect to what's legally should be done, then it's easy to kind of close those loopholes. Well, not easy, but it's possible to close those loopholes. But yeah, specifically in this example, the local governments really welcomed the project, especially as it's gone on. And in fact, a lot of the people that are sending complaints are actually government workers or health workers, because they may have a problem at work and they go to their supervisor who just dismisses it. And this is a way for them to kind of circumvent and say, no, something's going on here that's not right. And in general, the feeling we get is that the government appreciates this extra feedback and this extra knowledge. They want to know who the bad seeds are so that they can remove them in a lot of cases.
Maybe I can add a couple of other observations. I think we need to go back to what's actually happening in individual countries. There's too much of a risk that we talk here in great policies and generalities and expect that that will automatically get transferred in some way to what happens in developing countries. It won't, unless we all make it happen. Development is not something that is going to take place through actions here in New York. It's not even going to take place entirely by the actions of governments around the world. Development is going to take place through the actions of individual citizens and what they do and how they respond to the incentives and frameworks in which they work and live. And that's a long way from where we are here. And that leads me back a little bit to the observations of the other Sarah, if I may call you that, about the financing framework and the work here at the UN. I think we should be careful about an expectation that whatever is done about financing of UN activities and programs is going to have a profound effect on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. They will be achieved by what happens within individual countries and the money that is applied within those countries towards their achievement. Money from governments, money from the private sector, money from philanthropists, CSOs, etc. That's where the real action will be, and I think we need to be careful about applying broad sweep critique of what's going on in the UN with an expectation that that's going to translate in some profound effect, profound manner to fundamental change on the ground. Thank you.
I want to make a comment on what Jesse was saying about unsustainable practices. I mean, I think, again, kind of along the lines of the comment about the disconnect between local and global action. I mean, if we lived in a sustainable world, then we wouldn't be worrying about climate change. I mean, it's quite obvious that all actors, whether from governments to individual citizens, we really haven't quite cracked the nut yet in terms of living sustainably. So I think we need to acknowledge that, and you know, and we all know the role of externalities, you know, in business, for example, you know, and I mean something as fundamental as carbon pricing, we have yet to get an agreement on globally, and certainly in national context as well. So we're still very much dealing with fundamentals in that regard. You know, the issue of the actions of citizens. I mean, I mean, of course, that's a key element, and we're all citizens. You know, in our own context, and I think the issue of incentives, economic incentives in particular, is key. And this is where, you know, we have the nexus between structural, the need for structural change of society and of economic models, and then also personal behavior and how each of us as individuals live our lives. And when you talk about sustainable consumption and production, for example, you know, that's both society, the private sector, of course, enormous influence, and then we as individuals and families. Finally, I mean, regarding the Global Policy Forum, I mean, let's not forget that the part of the context of that work is not just a kind of sweeping structural, you know, view of UN development work, but also there is again an active campaign to work closely with business and the private sector to ensure that human rights and people-centered economies are at the center of this agenda. You know, on the fundamental freedoms part, I just wanted to mention that I just learned today from my colleagues in Geneva that at this session of the Human Rights Council, there was a first-time ever resolution passed on guidelines for civil society participation in public affairs for governments. And so, you know, these types of legal innovations, as technical as they may seem from a layman's point of view, to the extent that we can translate them into reality in the national level, will make a difference.
Thank you so much. I'm Irma Klein-Lumban-Tobing. I'm from Suriname, the UNA of Suriname. And I've had the privilege to serve my country several times in the mission of Suriname to the UN as ambassador, permanent representative. And now I'm on the side of the NGOs. That's why I came here to listen to the excellent presenters of Transparency International and Mr. Huffines, do I pronounce your name well, of CIVICUS. He was the one who made it possible that one of our members could go to Qatar so that we could learn about the important UNAOC. What I would like to say, the UN is a people's organization, and we are not yet so far that we can prove it in practice. That's why we have to come to meetings like this. I came especially to meet you in a networking part of this session. But I would like to compliment you, to say that I've learned a lot, and to say that we with UNA Suriname, we established here at the UN the MDG Global Watch. And with the MDG Global Watch, we have tried to do something, because it was to raise awareness and to try to promote the implementation. And the successor, in our feeling, of the MDG Global Watch is the Development Goals Global Watch, Sustainable Development. We left out the word sustainable, because if something is good, then it should be sustainable. So we have the Development Goals Global Watch, and what we would like to do, also in the session after this, the part of the networking, to see what the organizations like yours can do for us. Because all the time we are trying to come to headquarters. We have several people like Dr. Abraham Joseph, you know him, Dr. Emmanuel Gouet-Nyaek from Cameroon, and other people who are working with us. Because partnership is important. If you do not have partners everywhere, it won't be possible to do the job. One question, one final question. I think that it is Mr. Huffines who raised that. Our people in our countries, they know that it is important to learn much about those international organizations, but it is so difficult. And if it can be possible to establish something like, just like the UN has, you can follow meetings by webcast. Establish such a thing so that our people, like my country, that more NGOs can be involved in what is happening. Because it is not a great, but a very small number of people who are so privileged that they can come to the UN and follow meetings. and discuss things like those important things like this session which is being held right now. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for that comment. You know, just to mention one of the programs of CIVICUS and other partners is developing an Action for Sustainable Development platform, global platform of national platforms. So what we're seeking to do is work with NGOs on the ground who are engaged in the achievement of the SDGs and the monitoring and accountability of the SDGs to work with us so that we can provide capacity and training for NGOs at the national level so that they may engage their governments as equal partners in the development of sustainable development plans and also in the implementation thereof. So we can exchange information during the networking, and we can continue that conversation.
I just wanted to add one other thing to that. And I would encourage you, if you've not done so, to be in touch with the World Federation of UN Associations, WFUNA, which is also an important actor on this.
Just so that we can close, I think we've heard some very interesting comments, some very good presentations, some very interesting questions and challenging comments to our speakers today. I just want to, just so that we can close this particular discussion going back onto the SDGs, I was reading an article today about what it's going to take to unlock the SDGs, and this particular writer was talking about the importance of a systems thinking. In that regard, talking about joining up effort on individual goals, interrelationship between the goals, and recommendations by CSOs in order to do that. And I was just wondering, you know, what your thoughts were with regards to that. What is it going to take to unlock the SDGs from your experience, from the initiatives that you've been involved in? Just maybe some positive thoughts to close this discussion. And as I said, for those that still have questions, we'll be able to transition to the networking session.
What will it take to make it happen? It will take the efforts of everyone. No one's going to do it all, but if everyone is engaged, we can make a real difference. If you look at the MDGs 1 year after adoption, and you look at the SDGs 1 year after adoption, then I think we have reason to be modestly optimistic. But I think we all need to press our governments. One of the things I've been promoting is to try to get someone in the White House who would be responsible for the preparation of a single report by the United States government on the SDGs, an annual report. What we find is that the Domestic Policy Council talks about it. We find the National Security Council, but we don't have anyone who has an integrated responsibility. I would hope that we could see that kind of thing happen in the U.S., but then also around the world, and invite critique. National reports should not just be apologies and PR exercises. They should be about learning and progress together. Finally, I want to draw your attention before we wrap up to the executive summary of the PTF report. There are enough copies of the executive summary for everyone to have one if you'd like, and the full report, of course, is available as of today on the PTF website. Thanks.
So, well, first of all, again, I want to thank UNA USA, Council of Organizations, and PTA for an excellent program, and I'd like to thank you for inviting all of us, including myself, to participate. You know, we live in a very policy-rich environment here, right? Where, you know, reports and resolutions and there's a lot of words spoken and written and expressed. And so our challenge really is action. And so I think to the extent that we can take these reports, for example, once again, I'll plug the TAP Network toolkit. We need to take these and send them to our national partners and really encourage them to take action. I think we all know that the SDGs, I would say, throughout the 1990s, during all of the UN World Conferences leading up to the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals and now to the SDGs, it's been civil society. It's been citizens who have ensured that these agendas are adopted by member states in the UN, and then we need to continue to apply pressure to ensure that they're actually implemented, that action is taken. We all know the political tendency. I mean, it's already there that the adoption of the 2030 agenda, that was last year's agenda, and that was last year's administration, we're soon going, as we all know here in the United States and other countries, there's going to be a change of administration. Well, that's great, as long as the election, no, never mind. Yeah. Well, yeah, and the change of administration at the UN as well, of course. I think we heard some news today that Antonio Guterres may be the next Secretary General. So, we need to continue to pressure the governments in member states, the United Nations, and even ourselves that we made a commitment last year, and let's continue.
I think that's a perfect note on which to end the program, and to thank one and all our folks from Washington who came up specially for it, Ed and Sarah, our local Sarah, who also participated, our wonderful moderator and his organization, GFDD, as well as all the sponsors of the day. But the note I think we should all take away to our network session and beyond is that each of us does have a role in this process, and it's not something that any one of us can complete, but each one of us must start. It's a timely thought that one of the world's religions celebrating its new year. That's a major principle, that it's up to each of us to do our part. So with that note, thanks to one and all, and enjoy the program and the networking. Thanks for coming.